Welcome, everyone, to episode 17 of the Haelan Nurse Chronicles. I am your host, Dr. Lorre Laws, and I am a nurse, an author, and a trauma burnout expert. In today's episode, we're going to discuss how nurses who have been traumatized in their roles can develop the trauma response known as hyperindependence. Importantly, we'll explore how nurses who have experienced nurse-specific traumatization, much of which is avoidable, can begin their healing process today. So let's start first with asking and answering the important question, what is hyperindependence? Well, hyperindependence often stems from prior traumas, such as childhood trauma or nurse-specific trauma. In response to that experience, which is partially and not yet wholly healed, the person adapts and protects themselves by not relying on others, by not asking for help, and even rejecting help when it is offered, even when refusing that help is not in their best interest. The hyper-independent person may have difficulty delegating tasks or receiving the love and support that they crave from others. Hyper-independence leaves many people feeling unsafe and alone, feeling like they are responsible for taking care of everything in life all by themselves. There are a number of factors that contribute to trauma-related hyper-independence. And the first is there's this core assumption. It's a faulty assumption that reflects the unintegrated trauma, or what I like to call the unhealed bit of wisdom, that believes that social support is either not deserved or acceptable. The person may have experienced prior traumas or neglect that require them to become self-reliant, often at a very early age. Given all the trauma that the individual has endured, a sense of mistrust, loss of control, or uncertainty may develop in response to those traumatic experiences. So as a quick review, I know some of you have heard this before, but some of you are just joining us. Each of us, by virtue of being human, we have endured or been exposed to any number of individual traumas. These would be acute traumas like a car accident, chronic traumas like experiencing homelessness or being unsheltered for a period of time, complex trauma, which is any combination of the categories that I'm talking about. We have the developmental traumas, which are your attachment traumas, your adverse childhood events or ACEs, and neglect of all types. So by virtue of being humans, we are all exposed to that, just like everyone else. And it's a part of us, so it comes to work with us as well. And then at work, we're exposed to some nurse-specific traumas, some of which are inherent with the profession of nursing. And we have received training and education on how to navigate that, such as the vicarious or secondary trauma, where we are suffering alongside those in our care. And also trauma from disasters. We're all trained in that. But then there's this whole other category of avoidable nurse-specific traumatization, which would be historical trauma, which is how nurses are unknowingly transmitting the embodied and unhealed trauma from one generation of nurses to the other, sort of like that nurses eat their own expression that you've heard. There's also the workplace violence, which this would be from physical or verbal or emotional abuse from patients, their families, or indeed even our colleagues in the form of bullying, gaslighting, workplace incivilities, hazing, and the list goes on. There's system-induced trauma, and this is where the system itself, in its inefficiencies or inadequacies, actually creates the trauma. And then there's insufficient resource trauma, which is literally driving millions of nurses from the profession because we have too high patient-nurse ratios, not enough staff, not enough resources. Now, mind you, there may be enough nurses, but there's not enough nurses that are willing to work in these harsh conditions, nor should they, which is why it's mission critical that we address this issue. And then lastly, there's second victim trauma, and that would be the shame and guilt that nurses might carry in the wake of a near miss, an adverse or sentinel event. And this is avoidable in those instances, which is the large majority, when the root cause analysis shows us that we had a system error and not a human nurse error. But we still carry the shame and the blame and the stigma nonetheless, and that is not ours to carry. So those are the ways in which we can all be traumatized, and there are more, but those are the big ones. And now let's talk about how that traumatization can lead to a hyper-independent response. So for nurses, we have what I like to call that trifecta of trauma. We have the individual traumas right here, the base, the bottom of the pyramid that we all experience as by virtue of being human. And then we have the unavoidable trauma exposure that is inherent with nursing, such as secondary trauma or vicarious trauma or disasters that we need to address in our practices. All right, so we have individual, then we have the unavoidable trauma exposure, and then the trifecta is this one that's on top, and this is the avoidable nurse-specific trauma that is driving nurses from the profession because it is largely due to system or organizational inadequacies that is unduly traumatizing nurses, and oftentimes in a very systematic way. So what we have here is the trifecta, and nurses who have experienced the trifecta of trauma quickly learned that their management, their leadership, the C-suite executives are not supporting them with the safe practice conditions and nurse-patient ratios. So in response, nurses have had to adapt and really start depending upon themselves for their professional survival. After hearing broken promise after broken promise of there we'll get more staff, things will improve, please don't get out of our sinking boats, please stay in the boat with us. Well, after all of these cries for help and pleas, and we stay and we endure and we suffer, after a while, after broken promise after broken promise, nurses naturally develop a distrust of the leadership, of the management. And so the world is metaphorically resting on their shoulders, and they really feel as though there's no one to help them. So as part of a protective survival response, nurses tend to develop hyperindependence. And it's a very difficult way to be in the world. I myself have I have adapted in this way, and it took me some time to unwind it, but boy, life is beautiful on the other side. So let me see how I can help you. If you might be experiencing hyper-independence as a trauma response, you might be an overachiever. So questions to ask yourself: do I take on too much? Do I overcommit? Do I have a hard time saying no to being overworked or under-resourced? Well, if that's the case, you probably take on too many responsibilities without giving it much thought. It's just what you do. Well, that could be hyperindependence as a trauma response. Maybe you have an underlying, perhaps even subconscious mistrust in others. People who have been neglected or repeatedly been denied the resources and support they need for a safe nursing practice. Well, sometimes nurses just don't trust. They don't trust that it's ever going to change. Or you might tend to be a perfectionist. Sometimes perfectionism in the trauma response of hyperindependence, it results from trauma as we try to gain an outward sense of control to compensate for the lack of control we feel in our inner world. And this inner world disruption is brought on by the inordinate amount of avoidable nurse-specific trauma exposure. It's not a deficiency. It is not any character or defect or flaw in any nurse. We are carrying far too great of a trauma exposure load than anyone would be expected to carry. Perhaps you might be experiencing the trauma response of hyperindependence if you avoid depending on others, if you don't like to ask for help. Well, this is a quintessential trauma response, for you have been conditioned through your hardships to believe that there isn't any help for you. And if that's the case, then, well, there's really no point in asking for help that isn't there anyway. And so you can see how the mindset, how the adaptation is, and that's what we're shifting. You might be experiencing hyper-independent trauma response if you have few or no close relationships. This is a very protective response to traumatization. Relational neuroscience tells us that relationship is everything where trauma integration is concerned. So it's possible that if you didn't have the people that you perceived that you needed before, during, and after the traumatic event, whether it's in your personal or professional life, then you didn't learn how to lean into others during hardship. This leaves us feeling utterly alone despite craving close relationships. It's like an uncontrolled diabetic whose cells are literally starving in the land of plenty. We're surrounded by people who love us and want to help us, but we don't know how to let them in through that hyper-independent trauma response and adaptation. You might be experiencing a trauma response of hyperindependence if you're stressed or burned out. This describes nearly every nurse that I've encountered over 4 decades, but there is hope and there is a way out. And that's what my research and what my work is all about. So I don't know who needs to hear this, but nurse hyperindependence is a nurse-specific trauma response because the healthcare system, organizations, and/or colleagues have let you down. But there is hope, and you can count on me and my team to help you heal. So let's talk about some of the signs of hyperindependence. Nurses tend to carry a lot of shame that isn't ours to carry in the first place. Shame surrounding near misses, adverse or sentinel events that were secondary to the healthcare system or organizational inadequacies. These are adaptations to the traumas that we have endured. Nurses tend to self-isolate in the wake of trauma. We tend to feel anxious, maybe have some social anxiety, feel a little blue or depressed, burned out, or even downright resentful towards others. This is not a character flaw or defect. These are natural adaptations to the traumas that have been endured or that are ongoing. Nurses tend to be emotionally exhausted, burnout, perfectionist, mistrusting that others can or even will help us, down to the point where we actually refuse help when we're offered it because we've been let down so many times before. We may have difficulties starting or nurturing our existing relationships, or we may be closed off or secretive as a way to protect ourselves. These adaptations, again, are in responses to trauma and are not anything that is wrong with any one person. In other words, in response to the nurse-specific and other traumatic events that we have endured, we have adapted by, many of us have adapted by becoming ultra-independent, self-protective, controlling as a self-protective subcategory, right? Avoiding vulnerability, intimacy, or trust. We have been conditioned to believe that we are undeserving and unworthy of receiving support, especially by those that have not earned our trust, such as healthcare system organizations and even difficult or downright toxic colleagues, patients, families, etc. Well, I am here to tell you that after conducting 5 years of research across 4 disciplines, that you are so worthy, you are so deserving of the support that is here for you right now, today. To the extent that your hyper-independent self feels comfortable, please explore if and how you have been affected by taking my 30-second 5-question self-assessment. We'll drop the link in the show notes, but you can just go to drlorelaws.com/burnout. From after you answer 5 short questions, we will send you a complete report along with actionable steps that you can take towards healing when the time is right for you. And I hope the time is right for you now, because I am here with everything all the resources that I have developed to be of service through my nonprofit organization, the Haelan Academy. So please, if you are like I used to be, feeling that I have to crawl in a hole and heal by myself because there wasn't anyone I could count on to help me, well, know that that is a faulty assumption that developed as a part of your trauma response. Slowly, at your own pace, allow yourself to open to the possibility that there is help. There is an evidence-based framework that was drawn from 4 disciplines: integrative nursing, medical sociology, neurophysiology, and relational neuroscience. I have been down all of those rabbit holes on your behalf and processed all of that research into a very manageable, bite-sized healing nuggets just for you. So until next time, thank you. Thank you for all that you are, for all that you do. I see you, I feel you, I hear you, and I am here for you. From my healer's heart to yours. And until next time, namaste.